Welcome to another STARS webinar. I am David Earn, Director of Programs and Communication at STARS. For those of you who are here for the first time, STARS webinars are interactive discussions about future-oriented topics such as leadership, geopolitics, technology, climate change, and health. A select group of people is attending the webinar live, asking their own questions, and hundreds more watch STARS webinars later on as a recording in STARS Insights or on YouTube. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. Today we talk with Jayne PLUNKETT about leadership and risk, and particularly about how leaders can be ready for future risks. Jayne is Group Chief Risk Officer and member of the Group Executive Committee of AIA, the largest life insurance and securities group in Asia Pacific. She joined AIA in 2019 from Swiss Re, where she was most recently CEO Reinsurance Asia, Regional President Asia, and member of the Group Executive Committee. During her time with Swiss Re, Jayne held senior positions, including Head of Casualty Underwriting for Asia and Division Head Casualty Reinsurance. Prior to that, she was with GE Insurance Solutions. Jayne holds a Bachelor of Science in Business Administration from Drake University. She is also a Fellow of the Casualty Actuarial Society and a member of the American Academy of Actuaries. Last but not least, Jayne is also a member of the STARS International Board. Good afternoon to you, Jayne. Good to see you, and thank you for speaking in today's webinar.
Thank you, David. It's great to be here, and hello to everyone.
We now have 30 minutes to discuss with Jayne. I will take the privilege to ask the first couple of questions. In the meantime, if you have any questions for Jayne, please use the Q&A feature below to type in your question. Without any further ado, let's get right into it. Jayne, from your perspective as Group Chief Risk Officer of AIA, how do you see the impact of COVID-19 on society, and how does it impact your business?
I always think whenever I see people interviewed about this topic of COVID-19, it's always very dependent on which part of this this crisis that they're interviewed during. And sometimes I look back at some of the earlier things where people were interviewed in other TV interviews and things like that, and I think, you know, if only you knew then what we know now, right? So I'm always conscious of the fact that whatever we know is only what we've seen so far, and maybe a little bit of what we can predict of the future. So so everything I say may sound silly 6 months from now, you know, I don't know. But that's just one of the things we have to understand when we're living in this really fast-paced environment that we live in because of the conditions. But first of all, I'd just like to say I hope you're all happy and healthy and coping with the physical restrictions, as well as sometimes the mental restrictions you have from whatever kind of scenario you have at your own home. I'm fortunate to be in the office here in Hong Kong, where we do have some ability to move around. We have a relatively low case count, as you might know from Hong Kong. And we certainly in my office, we have split teams, and we're able to be relatively business as usual in a way with the help of technology. But if I look at society in general, it's I'll stay away from all the topics that you all know so well from reading the paper. But I think there's a few positives that I might not have expected at the beginning, and some are obvious and some are maybe less obvious. But the first one to me is I just really think we all take our health a lot more seriously. And I don't mean, you know, jogging every day and competing on steps and things like that, which we all know is important. But if we just think about, you know, the how quickly something could change, it's probably not something we spent a lot of time thinking about before. So I think that's brought a different realization to people. I think also, you know, when I think about it, and I think this is true of society, we also probably all collectively take a different view on the importance of protecting the more at-risk individuals. So we all know when it comes to COVID-19, we need to look after, you know, our parents if they're of a certain age, and we also need to look at people who have compromised health systems and those are probably things that we either, unless you were directly involved in it, you didn't think so much about before. But now I think about it a lot more, about how we have to take extra care for these kind of at-risk communities. And then the last thing, I think, again, I'm not dismissing all the other impacts on society, but I think we also better understand the individual actions we each have on each other. And what I mean by that is just the simple act of wearing a mask, right? As an example, the mask isn't helping you as much as it's protecting everyone else. And that's a very simple example of how our actions impact other people. And it's certainly not something, we always think about it, but I think now we think about it much more carefully all the time. So I think those are some of the positive aspects. They're all cultural, as you see. I think on the other side, there's obviously negative aspects, and you're all experiencing them all the time. But I think in terms of, it's easy for us to say we'll have a Zoom call, or we'll get on our Teams, or we'll use, FaceTime or whatever else. But that's because we all have access to technology, and we all have the means with which to buy it. We probably all have multiple devices, and we have high-speed connectivity, and we have our SIM cards and everything else. But we're unusual. That a lot of people in the world don't have that kind of connectivity. So I do wonder how lonely they are these days, because we stay connected through our technology, and other people are probably not enjoying that same thing. And I think that's one of the larger negatives. I also think we've seen just how fragile the health systems around the world are. So certain countries are struggling. Other countries are dealing with it a bit better, and it kind of comes back to the quality of the underlying health system in that country to some extent. And so we probably always knew that. Certainly those of us who work around the health industry knew it, but it's really shown a light on that situation around the world. And then the other thing I think about is I wonder if people will start to get a little bit more careful about meeting new people, which I think could have a negative impact. So I just don't know yet, because I think it's still too fresh, but you see that probably your social circle has already shrunk a bit. And what if everyone's social circle keeps shrinking a bit more and more and more? I'm not so sure that's good for, relationships and expanding our horizons. So I think that's one to watch, and I hope that's not an outcome.
If you look beyond the pandemic at the next few years, what risks do you see on the horizon that business leaders should keep in mind as they prepare for the new normal?
I think there's never a shortage of risks in the world. And then frankly, I've always been in the risk business. So almost my entire life, I've been in the business of taking and managing risk. So I don't think it will ever go away. But there's the obvious risks of how do you bring some of the small businesses back? And I think that's a kind of a fundamental issue around the world, and one that people talk about a lot. I think the other risk I see is just this economic divide, and I talked about it a little bit with technology, but I think we feel it more and more with the levels of unemployment, and you see it everywhere in the world, that there's just a how do I call it, exacerbated level of economic divide that has grown via this COVID pandemic. One of the things I sort of worry about a lot as well is just the sort of, it's feeding from the other one, the sort of the political situation around the world, and sort of the divide that we have between people, and of course we've always had that in the world. We have different political parties. I come from the U.S. We always have a multi-party system, but I think the other thing I see more and more is the effect that could have on the workplace. So I think that's something leaders in business need to think about, is realizing that when everyone comes into work every day, they come from different mindsets, they come from different ideals, and so we have to remember that, and remember that they all come from sort of a different angle. And as some of these things get farther apart, you have to remember that when you bring them into the office, they need to work together. So you have to find a way to make sure these aren't influencing the relationships that they have, in the office or in the work that do. And then lastly, I would just say, I think we can talk about all the risks. We all know about the debt that's accumulating, and there's many, many risks in the world. So we know that. But I also still look ahead at it. I find it kind of interesting because before this COVID pandemic, there was all this discussion about the future of work and what would jobs look like, and everyone was worried their job would be taken over by the robots. And now actually everybody's working at home, so that creates a much different environment for the future of work and maybe the future of corporate real estate. I don't know, but keeping an eye on, what does this look like long term for what work looks like. I don't know if it's a risk as much as it is, just also an opportunity. But maybe the last thing is it's easy to say after COVID, but the question I have in my mind is, when is that and what does that look like? Because it's possible that we kind of come in and out of lockdowns for a while, and we don't know, the future. And you can always have another one. So I think in some ways we've become prepared for the next crisis we might face, or the next pandemic we might face. But anyway, I just tried to stay away, David, a little bit from the obvious risks we know are out there. And I'm sure you'll come back to them.
Appreciate it. We have a first question from Peter Wiedel. He's the CEO of Waypoint Business Navigation. He's asking, what is your opinion and experience regarding the role of risk management as an enabler for new business models and innovation?
It's a great question. Actually, that's the reason I'm so happy to be a risk manager in general, because I think risk plays an important role of not avoiding business from expanding or not prohibiting business from expanding, but actually enabling it. So I always think of the role of myself and my team is to make sure we have the guardrails. So I think that's the job of the risk manager, is to make sure the guardrails are clear and the path is clear, and that the business has enough flexibility to be successful, but also has the right, as I said, guardrails to make sure it's still in business in the future. So I actually think, I always think of myself and my team as a partner to the business. We're trying to help the business navigate and make sure that we just think about scenarios, what could happen, both positives and negatives, but really protecting for those downside risks before we see them happen. So the best thing we can do is think through those things ahead of time, and put the right plans in place so that if they do happen, we at least know what our plan of attack is. And I really think that's the role of risk management, is to look around the corner and think about what might be coming in the future, and then make sure that the business leaders and the business in general is prepared as best as it can be for that. I'm not in the role of preventing business from happening. I'm in the role of preventing bad outcomes.
The next question comes from Polina Milashevskaya, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right. She is a digital enabler at Sülke Engineering, also based in Hong Kong. Her question is, how do you see the role of digital enablement to cope with the ever-increasing risks?
And so I always think that, the funny thing is, we've always had these kind of tools around, digital tools. And I think what I experience now is just the acceleration of the use of all these things. On the one hand, we all spend a lot of time, I'm sure, on this phone call talking about cybersecurity and cyber risk and the risk that it poses. And of course, we all have protections around those things. But I also think that all of this technology enables us, as you say in your question, to detect risk. And there's a lot of interesting work out there on how to scan better for risk and how to detect it before it happens. And so I think that, in my opinion, this entire sort of digital change actually should help us manage risk better than it is a threat. Of course, there's still things you have to protect from, but I think stopping the risk, stopping the event from happening in the first place, is much better than having to deal with it after the fact. And I think that's what these digital capabilities allow us to do these days.
The next question comes from a former colleague of yours at Swiss Re, from Anne Zimmermann. She's a senior country credit risk manager at Swiss Re in Zurich. She's asking, do you believe that the pandemic will lead governments to play a greater role in insurance solutions?
It's really hard to answer a question across all governments in the world because they're so different, right? I mean, I've lived in many different countries, and I can say the governments of those countries all are very different. But I think that, I don't know, you might be thinking about something specifically. I think that in general, it's just a personal view. I think it's normally most efficient for the private sector to handle the insurance systems, right? I think where it's more helpful for governments to organize or even take part of the risk is when you get to really severe risk, which is maybe what you're pointing to, things like pandemic risk. So I think there might be, I guess I'm not close enough to know what you might be pointing to, but I think government already takes quite a significant role in the financial services and insurance sector. So I think, probably in the area of health insurance and other areas, there's certainly a need for more, maybe I would call it public-private partnerships in terms of solving some of the big issues.
Anne is just writing in the comments. She's thinking of the pandemic exclusion clause in particular.
Yeah, she probably knows that as a reinsurer much better than everyone else. But just in a general way, I think, if we look at nuclear pools, if we look at some forms of agriculture, there's always been a place for governments to try to help solve areas where the risk is difficult to transfer directly into the private system. So if we think about terrorism cover in the US, for example, all of these things have played a role from time to time where the government can step in and help to facilitate the solution. And then generally over time, private industry can deal with it.
We have questions all over.
Okay, I'll try to be shorter.
No, that's fine. I take the next question from Stefan Thaler. He's the CEO of Swiss Life Investment Foundation. He's asking, do you think that in your organization, the management of opportunities is as systematically elaborated as the risk management side?
I have to say, I think, that's the kind of thing you should always be looking for, but I have to say the answer for us is yes. I mean, we're quite a commercial company at AIA, and when you work in Asia, it's a fast-paced environment, and the opportunities come frequently, and they come quickly. So I think that's also the interesting thing, is to make sure you have the balance right, because a healthy business needs to continue and grow and produce, but at the same time, as I said earlier, stay on the guardrails and make sure the risks are managed. So it's one of those things I'm always thinking about. I also think, risk management is also about making sure that you don't run the risk of becoming obsolete. So I think pushing into the future is also the part of the risk manager.
We have lots of STARS alumni from Swiss Re on this call. The next question comes from STARS alumna Donatella Fiala. She's the General Counsel Reinsurance, Europe, Middle East, Africa of Swiss Re. Her question, has the way you led changed during the pandemic? And if so, how? That's
a great question. I mean, one of the things that, I think we all see it. So if you think about it, it's a pandemic. And as the CRO, it means throughout last year and to some extent still this year, but was dealing on a daily basis with all the different elements of risk. So you've got financial risk, you've got operational risk, and we have sort of the physical security risk, and they all have different solutions and different timing. And so part of the challenge for me was just to keep all of those different teams running and energized and motivated, knowing that they there was almost no downtime in some ways. And finding a way to make sure that they took some downtime, even though no one can go on holiday, right, was a good challenge, because it's very energizing, as we all know, when we work at something at fast pace, but then at some point you need a little bit of a break. So I think that's part of it. I also think that I also, not that I didn't before, but I stopped to think a little bit more about the person, in terms of, what they might have been going through in all the hours of the day before I came across them. Because I think they have been stressful days in the past year, and people's private situations, are all different. So I think we just have to remember, that everyone comes into their job with a certain few hours that happened before they got there, and that might affect, how they're feeling that day or how they're working that day.
Next question comes from STARS alumnus Friedrich Haas. He's a managing partner at AIA in Bielefeld. He's writing, if the future is an unpredictable VUCA world, what do you think about the importance of methodology to deal with this unpredictability when all the expected scenarios don't happen?
So I'm not sure I'll get exactly at your question, but I guess from my perspective, I always balance, at least the role that I play, in both worlds. So I think methodologies are very helpful in terms of framing things. I think scenarios are very helpful in terms of framing things. But every day you have to show up and live in whatever circumstances you see. And those may or may not have been in your scenarios. So I think for all of us, we have to have this mixture of thinking about the what ifs, thinking about these scenarios, but keeping your eyes open to what's actually going on, because often it's moving at a pace where you actually can adjust as you go. So I think being, kind of, I don't want to say just in time, that's the wrong word, but being very timely in your actions is in some ways as important as having those scenarios and methodologies in the back of the head.
We have a question from Caroline Scherb. She is a partner at Lemongrass. She's asking, what is your view on how corporate communications, both internal and external, have changed in times of COVID?
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting, because there's always the standards for communication tools that we have, but I also go back to kind of what I said about there's the tools and there's what's behind the tools, and I think understanding some of these themes that are running through people's minds, I think, is really important in terms of the communications. So understanding that people are a bit divided in their views, and making sure that communications are understanding that before anything's communicated, I think, is important. But I think there's the obvious things like having more these kind of calls and things like that. Everyone's switched over. External communications, I think, is interesting, because I think a lot of people were communicating via going to conferences and building content that way. And I think now they're still building content, but I suspect they're having a harder time delivering it in a way. Now, maybe they've all caught up and they're making videos, but honestly, I have a hard time sometimes just sitting at home and watching videos that have been recorded. So I actually think it's probably a challenge that's not solved yet. And that there's probably going to be some really interesting innovations that come out of this, because we do need communication, and it has to be interesting at the same time.
I couldn't agree more. As we talked about, COVID-19 has or is dramatically highlighting the potential impact of high consequence, low likelihood risks. So as you said, ignoring such high consequence, low likelihood risks can be damaging to an organization, but preparing for everything is impossibly costly. So yeah. I'm wondering, do you have any advice how leaders can best prepare for those risks? I mean, how can they decide which risks their organizations should plan for?
Yeah, for me, it's a little bit about navigation, right? So I do think that you need to think through, what are the main risks that the organization faces. But the reality is, probably most of the things you can dream up, I think as someone said before, many of them won't materialize. So it's about the navigation in between. I think that's really, really important. And that's why, I also think if you think about how should businesses think about risk, or what's important, I always think about it in terms of there's a level of risk which is basically just, sort of the must-have. It keeps you in business. So if you think about certain financial risks that you face, certain regulatory risks, these are like survival skills, right? These are the things you must have to even be in business or to be a business. So that's the lowest threshold for me. Then you get to some of the kind of operational risks that you have to think about. And for me, these are about the quality of your business. So for us, that can be about, how we respond to customers, how quickly we pay claims. Those are some of the kind of operational things we see. And that has to do with quality of your business. So first you're just surviving, and then you're making your business better. And then the third layer of the risks that I look at anyway are more strategic risks. So how do you make sure that you're going to be the best? And how do you make sure that you get the best opportunities for the future as an organization? And to me, that's sort of the third level of risk to make the organization the best it can be. And I think of those as more strategic risks. So I think as a leader, you should always think about things in this way, not take any of them for granted, because it's easy to think that you have the survival risks covered. But you need to make sure you have those covered, because things like reputational risk, can hurt your survival in a split second. So I don't think there's a way to be completely prepared. And I think what's most important is to be alert and to be able to navigate and respond.
So any future-oriented organization has to take actions to reduce the potential impact of these risks. What is an acceptable level of risk? I mean, of course, that will really vary from company and industry, but do you have any general guideline to indicate which level of risk you would see as acceptable?
I think it's there's all the sort of statutory risks, and we all know about thresholds and tolerances and things like that. So to me, I set those aside. Those are given. That's a governance. I actually think it's a little bit of a company culture question. I think if you look around, there's certain companies that have a culture of taking more risk. They also can tolerate it, maybe as a management or as individuals. And then there's others that are probably more risk averse. And I don't think one is better and one is worse. I just think they lead to different outcomes. So I think what's most important is to understand where that comfort level is, and to make sure you're in that comfort level. Because we can textbook define what's the right level of risk, but I think there's a personal risk that you take in your organization every day, and then there's an organizational risk around strategy, and to me that has more to do with the company culture than anything else.
Sadly, we have already run out of time. But to ask you one final question. How do you see the role of the Chief Risk Officer, your role? How do you see this role changing in the next few years?
I think it changes every day, if I'm honest. Partly because everything is so fast-paced, right? As I said at the beginning, and we are living in uncertain times and unprecedented times. But I think it depends where the CRO is in the organization. But I think I kind of come back to one of the very first questions. And I do think that CROs, and many do already, but the more they can play a role in terms of partnering with the business and helping business to grow, the stronger the role of the CRO will be. And so I think that's, for me, something that I don't know if I can predict we'll see that, but I hope we'll see that, because I think that makes for stronger organizations. And I think that's what we all need, particularly in this post-COVID world.
With that, I would like to thank you very much, Jayne, for your time and for sharing your perspective with us. Thank you, Jayne.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
I would also like to thank all our alumni who participated in this webinar. Next Friday, on 12th of February, we launch a new virtual format exclusively for STARS alumni, friends of STARS, and donors, and we call it the STARS Alumni Lounge. We will kick off the series with a 30-minute power workshop with STARS alumna Shira Kaplan. She is the CEO of Cybers, a leading cybersecurity company in Zurich. We'll talk about the role of cybersecurity in a hyper-digitalized economy. So in a way, we're following up on what we talked about today. Further down the road, the next public STARS webinar will take place on the 26th of February against the backdrop of rapidly worsening humanitarian situation in many regions around the globe. We will discuss with Peter Maurer, the president of the International Committee of the Red Cross, what it takes to meet humanitarian needs in complex and protracted crises. As always, you have received further information about these events in your inbox, hopefully, and I hope to see you next time. In the meantime, take care and stay healthy. Thank you and goodbye.